Have you ever sliced into a loaf of bread and noticed something a little different about it? The crust crackles, the inside is full of airy holes, and the flavor has a gentle tang that regular bread doesn't quite have. That bread is likely sourdough, one of the oldest types of bread humans have ever made. Long before commercial yeast existed, people were baking bread using only flour, water, and naturally occurring microbes in the air. Today, we will uncover the fascinating science and history behind one of humanity's oldest breads, right here on History of Simple Things. At its core, sourdough is bread that rises through natural fermentation rather than commercial yeast. Most modern breads rely on packaged baker's yeast, a single strain of yeast that rapidly produces carbon dioxide to make dough rise. Sourdough, on the other hand, uses a mixture of wild yeast and beneficial bacteria that develop naturally in a mixture of flour and water. This mixture is called a sourdough starter. When properly maintained, a starter becomes a living ecosystem of microorganisms that feed on the carbohydrates in flour and produce gases and acids as byproducts. These microorganisms are the real secret behind sourdough. Wild yeast works much like commercial yeast, producing carbon dioxide that creates bubbles in the dough. Those bubbles expand during baking, giving sourdough its signature open crumb, the airy holes you often see inside the bread. But sourdough also contains lactic acid bacteria, the same type of microbes involved in foods like yogurt and sauerkraut. These bacteria produce organic acids, including lactic acid and acetic acid, which gives sourdough its slightly tangy flavor. The balance between yeast and bacteria is what makes sourdough unique. In a healthy starter, the microbes live in a kind of partnership. The yeast helps produce carbon dioxide for rising, while the bacteria contribute acidity and flavor. The acids also make the environment slightly hostile to harmful microbes, which helps preserve the dough naturally. This is one reason sourdough bread tends to stay fresh longer than many other types of bread. The process of making a sourdough starter is surprisingly simple, though it requires patience. All it takes is mixing flour and water and letting it sit at room temperature. Over the course of several days, naturally occurring microbes from the flour, the air, and even the baker's hands begin to colonize the mixture. At first, the mixture may smell strange as different microorganisms compete for dominance. But eventually, a stable community forms, dominated by wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria that thrive together. Once the starter becomes active, bubbling, slightly sour-smelling, and capable of rising dough, it can be used to bake bread. Bakers typically feed their starter regularly by adding fresh flour and water, which keeps the microbes alive and active. With proper care, a sourdough starter can live for years, decades, or even generations. Some bakeries proudly maintain starters that are said to be over 100 years old. Sourdough's origins stretch far back into human history. Archaeological evidence suggests that fermented bread was already being made in ancient Egypt around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Historians believe that early bakers may have discovered fermentation by accident. Perhaps a mixture of grain and water was left sitting too long and began to bubble naturally. When baked, the resulting bread would have been lighter and more flavorful than flat, unleavened bread. Once people noticed the improvement, the technique likely spread quickly. For thousands of years, natural fermentation remained the standard method for making bread. It wasn't until the 19th century that commercial yeast became widely available. With the invention of packaged yeast strains, bread could be produced faster and more predictably. This convenience eventually pushed sourdough out of many everyday kitchens and bakeries. However, sourdough never disappeared completely. In certain places, it remained an important tradition. One famous example comes from San Francisco, where sourdough bread became strongly associated with the city during the California Gold Rush in the mid-1800s. Miners and settlers carried sourdough starters with them because they were reliable and didn't require purchased yeast. The unique climate and local microbes in the region helped create a distinctive flavor that many people still associate with San Francisco sourdough today. Another interesting feature of sourdough is how fermentation affects the structure of the bread itself. During the long fermentation process, enzymes in the flour begin breaking down complex starches and proteins. This slow transformation helps develop flavor, but also changes the dough's texture. Gluten, the network of proteins that gives bread its elasticity, develops gradually over time, which contributes to sourdough's chewy texture. Fermentation also makes certain nutrients easier for the body to absorb. Whole grains contain compounds called phytates, which can bind minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium. The acids produced by sourdough fermentation help break down some of these compounds, making the minerals more bioavailable. This doesn't mean sourdough is magically healthier than all other bread, but it does mean the fermentation process can improve digestibility and nutrient availability in some cases. The flavor of sourdough can vary dramatically depending on how it's made. Temperature, fermentation time, the type of flour, and even the local microbes in the environment all influence the final taste. Some sourdough breads are only mildly tangy, while others develop a much sharper, more pronounced sourness. Bakers can adjust these variables to shape the character of the bread they produce. The crust is another hallmark of sourdough bread. When baked in a hot oven, especially with steam, the exterior of the dough forms a thick, crackling crust. This crust not only adds texture but also helps trap moisture inside the loaf, keeping the interior soft. The contrast between the crisp crust and the airy crumb is part of what makes sourdough so satisfying to eat. So the next time you bite into a slice of sourdough bread, you're not just tasting flour and water baked together. You're tasting the work of wild yeast and bacteria, the slow chemistry of fermentation, and a culinary tradition that predates modern kitchens by millennia. What looks like a simple loaf is actually the result of a living process that humans discovered long before they understood the science behind it. And that process continues to rise, bubble, and bake its way through kitchens around the world today. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.